I think this chapter of Coontz really did a good job of highlighting kind of that there was a lot of things that played into the change of kind of the golden age of marriage, and it's hard to pin down one exact point that said, oh, this is exactly why the marriage shifted. There was a lot of factors, kind of like in a heaving volcano in the 1920s, but there was just a lot of factors. So I think it was a few things that stood out to me was that 1/3 of every couple in the 1950s were divorced after like the 1950s, of course, like over time. So I think it just kind of goes to show that even this happy like marriage couple thing didn't last for the long term. Um, and I think another thing that stood out to me was a lot of the marriages, the wives in those marriages said they wanted their daughter to be more like educated and more independent than they were. They didn't want their daughters to be in the same type of marriages that they were in. Um, Another thing that was interesting was that this quote on page 252 was that women were considered to be ideal workers because they were not entrenched in the heavily unionized, industrialized jobs and could be paid less than men with families to support. So I think this is just showing you the like exploitation of women's labor at the time, and yet women still preferred this to working in the home, and they still kind of enjoyed their job. They're kind of finding their identity in their career. They're learning how to enjoy what they're doing. They're enjoying it more than the housework. They're learning how to become independent women. And it was kind of an increase in the opportunities, and it was helped by the recession and the inflation. So men had less jobs in like manufacturing, and so women were forced into the workforce. And so this kind of all manifested in kind of women being like, oh, we can make our own destinies and we can economically support our own destinies. And we don't really need men to be there to help us to do that anymore as much. And this male breadwinner thing, we tried that. It wasn't the ideal we expected. It wasn't the ideal we wanted. We're kind of done with that. Next. So they kind of pushed off of that. I think another thing that was revolutionary in this time period was the invention of the birth control pill, or like just better contraception in general. On page 254 it says by 1970 60% of all adult women were using the birth control pill on or an intrauterine device or have been sterilized. So it's just saying that premarital sex, just like more sex was happening without the potential consequence of like unwanted pregnancies. So the birth rate was dropping, which allowed people to focus more on relationship issues between men and women, and really push forward that issue of women need better rights, and women need like actual, you can't pay them less. There were still rules in place that prohibited like interracial marriages. Like I didn't even realize that was a thing still in like the 1960s that prohibited interracial marriages. So that was crazy, and those were repealed around the same time frame. The no fault divorce laws came out around 1972, I think, although a lot of divorce cases were still picking up on that fault thing, but they're kind of like no fault divorce, but they're kind of framing it as fault. There was like also the illegitimate child thing kind of stopped being like, more rights were given to biological parents for their children. So there weren't like as many illegitimate children. They were given rights, and they weren't like stamped on their birth certificates. I didn't realize how recent all of this change was. I didn't even realize there were laws in place that prohibit you from marrying interracially in the 1900s. Like, for some reason that wasn't even on my radar. I didn't even realize how it was crazy. That was crazy. And I think that there's another factor that played into this like whole shift from the male breadwinner into the marriage kind of that we see in the 1970s. And this quote that I found on page 258, they found a huge drop in support of conformity to social roles and a much greater focus on self-fulfillment, intimacy, fairness, and emotional gratification. So this is kind of like Mount Maslow, like we talked about earlier in the semester, where they're no longer looking to fill that like basic level of, we need to survive, we need to like share the gender roles, we need to, not gender roles, but like work, we need to like just make it through the day and we produce. They're like, oh, we actually want to meet some of those higher levels of like love, belonging, self-esteem, gratification. We want to meet some of those higher level roles, and that's what they're kind of seeking to fulfill now in the 1970s. And they're kind of realizing that they've left out 50% of the generation, 50% of the population, sorry. And I think the men were still, also the book talks about like men weren't completely happy just being providers for the family either. Nobody was really happy with this setup, and everybody was just kind of like under the surface. And so there was a lot of factors leading up to the change, so it's hard to pin down an exact factor. And as to the article that we read about the politics of housework, I thought it was really amusing. There's a quote on page 3 that says, women's liberation really isn't about a political movement, meaning the revolution is coming too close to home, also meaning I'm only interested in how I am oppressed and not how I oppress others. And I think that this is just so interesting because we often focus on, like, women's suffrage was a focus by women on how they are oppressed and not how, well, women weren't really oppressing others, but like men, when men focus on things, they focus on how they oppress others. So I think this is just such a good thought, like what we like to focus on how we are oppressed and not how we oppress others sometimes. And so I think like even in housework, which is such a great example, and I think they go through so many more things, like nobody likes housework, it is tedious, it's awful, and it should be shared equally between the sexes. And I think we're still working on that today because we're still working through some of these like gender roles that have been like perpetuated throughout generations and centuries. But it's interesting to find that like the oppressor, we want the power. Later on in the article, she talks about something we glorify on page 4, actually. She says, we glorify the oppressor, wanting to be like the oppressor, wanting the oppressor to like them, mostly because the oppressor held all the power. So maybe, like, often it can go both ways. I think that this article kind of shows, like, even through something as silly as housework, we need to think about some of the greater issues sometimes in society through the view of who's the oppressee and who's the oppressor. And this applies in housework, this applies in marriage, this applies in so many other issues too. So I just thought this was a really well written article. Another thing that stood out to me was just like the idea that it hurts them more than it hurts you. Remember that they're like losing leisure time, so just keep on keeping on. Like, it's a traumatizing experience for them sometimes to like actually have to work because the menial task is not what they're used to doing. So I just thought it was a really well written essay, and I didn't quite think about all the like change from men, like where they're not used to working and now they're like, oh, I have to do menial chores and I think that's beneath me. So I think it was a good approach from a woman author saying this is why they might think it's beneath them and here's how you can combat that. So yeah, and housework isn't fun for anybody, so that's kind of funny.